You are standing on the edge of the Tang dynasty's glittering capital, Chang'an. It is the year 851 CE, and the air is thick with the scent of sandalwood, rice wine, and damp earth. The markets buzz with life, the bureaucrats scurry to their offices, and the imperial court thrives behind its red lacquered gates. But if you were to follow the winding alleyways out of the bustling heart of the city, and into the quieter quarters of a miner, noble's residence, or perhaps into the shed, latrine of a government scribe's lodging, you'd stumble upon something quietly revolutionary. Thin sheets of plant fiber, soft, flexible, and slightly fragrant. This, you realize, is paper, but not for writing, no characters or calligraphy, no imperial seals, just folded, unmarked, functional paper. Its purpose, hygiene. This is where the story of toilet paper begins. Not in a 20th century American convenience store aisle, but here, centuries ago, in a corner of East Asia where innovation was as common as dust. Paper, before toilet paper existed. The world used what it had. In most early civilizations, hygiene after defecation was a matter of natural improvisation. In ancient Greece, it was not uncommon to use smooth pebbles or shards of ceramic known as persoi for wiping. In Rome, the infamous torsorium, a communal sponge on a stick, served public latrines, soaked in vinegar between uses. Even the wealthiest citizens didn't escape this communal reality, but China was already ahead in ways most civilizations hadn't imagined. Long before it was used for wiping, paper had become a prized material for record-keeping and art. It had been invented during the Han Dynasty around 105 CE by the court eunuch Cai Lun, or so official history tells us. His method used mulberry, bark, hemp, waste, and old rags to produce a more affordable and practical alternative to the silk scrolls of the elite. Yet it would take another 7 centuries for someone to decide to use this precious invention, or a far less glamorous task. Personal hygiene. The Tang Dynasty and a soft innovation by the 6th century, paper was becoming widespread. Bureaucracy was the lifeblood of the empire, and paper its veins. But for the common people, rags, sticks, leaves, or even hands remained the tools of the lavatory. In 589 CE, the scholar Yenji Tui wrote paper on which there are quotations, or commentaries from the 5 classics or the names of sages, I dare not use for toilet purposes. It was not a description of toilet paper's invention, but it confirms what was beginning to happen. Paper was being used for wiping, cautiously, selectively, only paper without moral or literary value. Even in wiping, reverence to scholarship prevailed. By the 9th century, the Arab traveler and writer Suleiman al-Togia visited China and made an astute observation. He remarked that the Chinese do not wash themselves with water when they have done their necessities, but they only wipe themselves with paper. The sentence, almost incidental, carries the weight of revolution. Here was the earliest known account from an outsider that confirmed a culture using paper not as literature, not as currency, but as sanitation, the making of toilet paper. Unlike modern mass-produced rolls, early toilet paper wasn't standardized. It varied in size, thickness, and fragrance depending on one's wealth and status. In the Tang and Song periods, sheets might have been as large as today's letter-sized paper or folded into smaller squares. Some sources suggest that the elite had perfumed paper, perhaps steeped in herbs or oils, to counter any unpleasantness. Imagine wiping yourself with soft bamboo-based sheets, delicately scented with jasmine or camphor. For some, it may have been the most luxurious experience of the day. Meanwhile, for peasants and laborers, the innovation remained distant. A tattered rag or handful of hay was still the norm, and paper, though more affordable, was still too valuable. For the posterior, for them, wiping was just another chore, functional, unpleasant, and rarely discussed. Imperial bottoms. In the early 14th century, during the Yuan dynasty, several centuries after the Tangs, a remarkable entry appeared in the imperial records. It stated that 720,000 sheets of toilet paper were manufactured annually for the imperial court alone. These sheets measured about 2 feet by 3 feet, enormous by modern standards, and were unscented. But even more revealing is this: the emperor, himself, reportedly, had his own supply of soft, perfumed paper, crafted specifically for his personal use, and not just a few 15,000 sheets were set aside each year for the emperor's hygiene. This number tells us several things. First, that toilet paper was not just in use, it was systematized. It was industrialized in small ways. It was, in effect, institutionalized. Yet despite this, it remained an elite commodity. While the emperor luxuriated in clouds of perfumed mulberry paper, villagers on the edge of Yunnan were likely still relying on handfuls of straw or the occasional leaf. A technological marvel had emerged, but only in narrow corridors of wealth and status. Why didn't it spread? You might wonder, why didn't the world adopt toilet paper immediately, especially when China was clearly so far ahead? It's a fair question. The answer lies in a blend of geography, custom, and infrastructure. For one, the rest of the world had different hygiene traditions. In Islamic societies, water played a central role in cleanliness. Ablution was spiritual as well as hygienic. The idea of wiping with dry paper felt inadequate or even unclean to many. In medieval Europe, sanitation was primitive, and toilet habits were based more on accessibility than innovation. Most people wiped with straw, hay, or reused scraps of fabric. The concept of purpose-made wiping material never gained traction, perhaps because no one thought to challenge the norm. China had invented something extraordinary, but the invention never became a movement. It stayed nestled in the upper echelons of society. A quiet innovation used behind closed doors, never shouted from rooftops. Maybe it was simply too boring to become a global marvel, or maybe history, in its quietest corners, simply forgot. Why did a civilization that created something so practical never promote it to the world? Why did the invention of toilet paper stall only to be rediscovered centuries later, almost as if for the first time? Lost in the loo. Why the world ignored toilet paper for 1,000 years. You know that feeling when a brilliant idea flickers into existence and then quietly disappears, like a match that struck, flares with promise, but never quite sets anything alight. That's what happened to toilet paper. The Tang and Song dynasties lit the match. The Yuan dynasty fanned the flame. Yet, somehow, toilet paper failed to spread beyond China's borders or even to its own lower classes for over 1,000 years. In an age of Silk Road trade, gunpowder exports, and widespread diplomatic missions, how could something as basic, as universally needed, as wiping be forgotten? Let's go deeper. Let's examine how an invention so useful could become so unimportant. The bureaucracy of hygiene. In the Tang capital of Chang'an, court life was rigidly structured. Ministers and magistrates rose at dawn, donned ceremonial robes, and sat for hours in silent meetings with the emperor or their superiors. Etiquette governed everything, including bodily functions. Lavatories in the imperial court were carefully maintained. These weren't the foul-smelling pits of later medieval Europe. They were tiled, ventilated, and sometimes even had flowing water systems connected to city canals. Paper was part of this carefully managed routine, cut into squares, folded neatly, and placed within reach. But here's the twist. Toilet paper wasn't seen as revolutionary. It wasn't lauded. It didn't have a name, a champion, or a movement. It was just there, quiet, uncelebrated, and thus invisible to history, much like the servants who changed the emperor's chamber pot. The humble sheets of toilet paper performed their duty in silence and faded into the background. Even as the imperial court issued production quotas for hygiene paper, there was no indication this would ever leave the palace walls. Why? Because it was never branded as innovation. It wasn't written about, debated, or praised, and without fanfare, history has a way of forgetting. Regional blind spots. While the Chinese emperor was wiping with perfumed mulberry sheets, what were others using? Let's take a little journey around the world, an unpleasant one perhaps, but enlightening. In Japan, traditions leaned toward water and wooden sticks, called chigi. Some sources suggest a hybrid of water and scraping tools. But toilet paper didn't appear until Western influence much later. In the Islamic world, water was considered essential. Cleanliness wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, ritual. Washing a stinger was part of daily life. The idea of wiping with dry paper wasn't just unnecessary, it was inadequate. In Europe, the Dark Ages had begun. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets. Sanitation was rudimentary at best, non-existent. At worst, moss, hay, and scraps of linen were common. Communal privies often stank of disease and decay. The idea of specially made wiping paper, unthinkable. In India, smooth stones, water, and the left hand were standard. As in Islamic culture, water was seen as superior. Dry wiping would be considered unclean. The Chinese invention, then, was a cultural outlier. It didn't align with religious practice, resource availability, or regional hygiene philosophies, and so, even if it was exported, whether physically or through stories, it found no fertile ground to grow. Ironically, The thing that made China advanced paper was so common in their world that its alternate uses were overlooked by others. To the outside observer, paper was for writing, not wiping. Let's talk about trade. China was connected to the world through the Silk Road and later maritime routes. Porcelain, tea, silk, and even books traveled across Asia, the Middle East, and eventually into Europe. But toilet paper, not a priority. Merchants dealt in luxury and survival items with visible value. A case of tea could command a fortune. A beautifully glazed ceramic bowl was an object of desire. But paper, especially paper meant for hygiene, had no prestige. In places where Chinese inventions like gunpowder and the compass were adopted, toilet paper wasn't part of the discussion. No one was writing letters home about the emperor's perfumed sheets. There were no market demands, no treaties, no scribbled notes from Marco Polo describing Chinese toilet habits. The invention fell through the cracks, not because it wasn't useful, but because it wasn't considered useful enough to mention. You might ask, why didn't even the Chinese promote it more widely within their own culture? Part of the reason lies in class division. A luxury for the few. In Teng and Song China, most peasants didn't even have access to writing paper, let alone disposable hygiene sheets. The imperial bureaucracy generated massive amounts of documentation, but recycling this paper for toilet use was mostly limited to those within the state apparatus. If you were a farmer in Sichuan, you might wipe with straw. If you were a monk in a remote monastery, you might use cloth or bamboo sticks. Toilet paper never became standardized across the empire because it remained too expensive, too urban, and too elite. The Yuan dynasty's imperial toilet paper was handcrafted from pure plant fibers, often unscented but soft. For the emperor, 15,000 sheets were produced annually, but the rest of China, they managed with what they had. The irony is clear. The technology existed, but the infrastructure to democratize it didn't. It's the classic story of innovation without distribution. When innovation isn't sexy. Part of the problem was perception. Paper for writing, honorable, sacred, carriers of Confucian wisdom and dynastic decrees. Paper for wiping, unspeakable, dirty, unworthy of mention in polite conversation. And so, historians focused on other things: battles, emperors, poetry, calligraphy, dynastic change. Lavatory innovation didn't make the scrolls. Even archaeological records, which tell us so much about burial customs, city layouts, and pottery trends, are relatively silent on toilet paper. Perhaps it was too disposable. Perhaps it was biodegradable. Perhaps it was simply invisible to those recording history. This is how revolutions die, not with rejection, but with silence. What's most curious is that toilet paper would not appear in Europe until the 19th century. In 1857, American entrepreneur Joseph Gayety began marketing medicated paper for the water cleaner. It came in flat sheets, infused with aloe, and was sold as a health product preventing hemorrhoids and other ailments. He even stamped his name on every sheet. It was a modest success. Then, in 1890, the Scott Paper Company introduced toilet paper on a roll, a format that has barely changed since. Suddenly, the world caught up with China. 12 centuries later, Gayety and the Scott brothers are remembered today as pioneers, but their work was a reinvention, not a true innovation. The Chinese had done it all before, just without the marketing, the mass production, or the ego. It's a quiet lesson from history. It's not always about who invents it first. It's about who tells the story loudest. There's one final detail that underscores just how forgotten this Chinese innovation became in modern times. Chinese toilet paper usage was significantly lower than Western countries, even into the late 20th century. In rural areas, alternatives like water, cloth, or nothing at all remained common. Public toilets often lacked paper entirely. Travelers were advised to carry their own. In a tragic twist of fate, the civilization that first pioneered toilet paper no longer led the world in its use. Innovation, it seems, had looped back on itself. So what does this tell us about the course of history? Is it that not all ideas, no matter how practical, can flourish without the right cultural, economic, and historical soil? Or is it that the things that quietly make our lives better are often ignored in favor of louder, more glamorous achievements? The toilet paper resurrection, a revolution rediscovered. You're standing now in a cramped, gaslit apothecary on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The year is 1857. The air smells of medicinal alcohol, laudanum, and old wood. On the dusty shelf between a bottle of cod liver oil and a stack of leeches sits a curious product: Gayety's medicated paper. thin, slightly waxy sheets, sold for $1 a pack. Each square is marked with a small inscription, J.C. Gaiety, the inventor. You're holding the Western world's first marketed toilet paper, and yet China did this over 1,000 years ago. How did an ancient, practical, even luxurious Chinese innovation vanish for centuries, only to be reintroduced as if for the first time? Let's bring this curious tale to its close by following how toilet paper made its long, slow comeback across oceans, through cultural change, industrial innovation, war, and finally into the homes of billions. The rise of the water closet. By the mid-19th century, the Western world was undergoing a bathroom revolution. The Industrial Revolution had transformed not only manufacturing and cities, but also domestic life. Flush toilets called water closets were becoming popular among the urban elite in England, France, and America. But with this convenience came a dilemma. Traditional materials like rags, newspaper, and hay were clogging pipes and sewers. Public health was worsening in rapidly growing cities, and waste management had become a full-blown crisis. Enter Joseph Gaiety. Gaiety wasn't just a paper maker. He was a health enthusiast. He advertised his product as a medical necessity, claiming his medicated paper prevented piles, hemorrhoids, and other anal ailments. It was treated with aloe vera, packaged in flat sheets, and sold in pharmacies. Yet his product flopped. The idea was too new. Most people still using outhouses or chamber pots saw no need to spend money on something they could get for free. The idea of buying paper for the bathroom felt absurd. People laughed and flushed. Gaiety faded from memory. Enter the Scott brothers. 30 years later, in 1890, two brothers, Clarence and E. Irvin Scott, picked up where Gaiety left off, but they didn't package toilet paper as medicine. They packaged it as plumbing protection. This was smart marketing. By the late 1800s, indoor plumbing was becoming widespread in upper-class homes. The last thing a wealthy family wanted was a clogged water closet. The Scott Paper Company began selling rolls of toilet paper under different brand names to hotels, hospitals, and railroads. They sold it discreetly. That was the key. You see, even in the Victorian age, talking about bodily functions was taboo. No one wanted to admit they needed paper for wiping. The Scotts avoided printing their name on the product itself. Unlike Gaiety, they offered generic branding and private labeling, making it easier for businesses to stock it without embarrassment. By the 1920s, toilet paper rolls had quietly entered the American household. And so the modern toilet paper industry was born not with fanfare or innovation, but with marketing, discretion, and an eye for domestic plumbing needs. The European catch-up. Toilet paper in Europe came later still. In Britain and much of Europe, even into the 20th century, toilet habits varied wildly. In rural areas, people used pages torn from catalogs or newspapers. The famous Sears Roebuck catalog doubled as reading material and toilet tissue across much of the American countryside. In France, the bidet, developed as early as the 17th century, remained a standard fixture. Dry wiping was less popular, especially among the upper classes, who considered water more hygienic. But as mass manufacturing expanded and public sanitation became a larger concern, Europe too began to adopt toilet paper. The first British toilet paper on a roll was produced in 1942, during World War II, right in the middle of rationing and wartime shortages. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. By the 1950s, toilet paper was common in most urban Western homes. Meanwhile, the country that had invented it had not kept up. Back in China, a forgotten legacy. By the early 20th century, much of China was still using water, cloth, or natural materials for hygiene. Toilet paper existed, but it wasn't mass-produced or widely available. The rural majority had no access to such luxuries. After the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, China entered a long period of war, civil unrest, and revolution. Basic sanitation took a backseat to survival. Public toilets were crude and modern. Plumbing was rare outside major cities. In 1949, the Communist Party came to power and launched a campaign to modernize industry and infrastructure. Yet, even in the years that followed, toilet paper remained relatively rare. It wasn't until the 1980s that it became more widely available in China's urban areas, and even then, you were expected to bring your own. Public restrooms often didn't provide it. Travelers learned to carry small rolls or packets in their bags just in case. It's a deep irony. China, pioneers of toilet paper, spent much of the modern age behind the rest of the world in adopting it widely. But things were changing. The paper boomed up by the 1990s and early 2000s. global toilet paper consumption exploded. As developing nations adopted Western-style plumbing, the need for flushable, soft and hygienic toilet tissue became universal. Toilet paper had become a commodity, an expectation, a necessity. In 2004, China's own tissue industry began a massive boom. By 2010, it had become one of the world's leading producers and consumers of toilet paper. Brands like Vinda Hengen and Li and Man Paper were exporting products globally. And yet, most Chinese citizens remained unaware that their ancestors had invented the concept centuries earlier. It had taken a full millennium for the cycle to complete. Toilet paper in crisis. 2020. In early 2020, something unexpected happened. The COVID-19 pandemic sparked a global toilet paper panic in the United States, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Supermarket shelves were stripped of tissue. Photos went viral. Memes flooded the internet. People hoarded toilet paper as though it were food or fuel. Why? Toilet paper had become a symbol of control. When the world felt chaotic, people reached for the most basic comfort. Something familiar, something soft, something that kept them clean. For the first time in history, people realized just how much they valued it. Ironically, it was during this crisis that many began to ask, who invented toilet paper, anyway? Historians replied, the Chinese. Over 1,000 years ago, people were astonished. The match struck so long ago was finally seen for what it was, a spark that had quietly changed the world. What does this strange tale of innovation, loss, rediscovery, and mass adoption tell us? It tells us that ideas alone are not enough. Toilet paper was invented in China not because someone had a stroke of genius, but because they had access to cheap paper, an advanced sanitation system, and a courtly culture that valued comfort and cleanliness. Yet it remained a niche product, unpolluted, undocumented, and ultimately forgotten because society didn't think it needed it, and historians didn't think it mattered. The West didn't rediscover toilet paper through Chinese books or records. It reinvented it, independently, when plumbing demanded it, and even then, it wasn't science or need that made it succeed. It was marketing. The toilet paper succeeded because someone finally convinced people they couldn't live without it. So, while the Chinese may have invented toilet paper, the West packaged, marketed, and monetized it. Both parts of the story are true. Toilet paper is rarely discussed in history books. You won't find it celebrated in museums, inscribed in stone, or held up as a milestone of human progress. But maybe it should be, because its story is the story of everyday humanity. The things we do quietly, the comforts we take for granted, the tiny innovations that shape how we live. Toilet paper is not flashy, it doesn't roar like a cannon or soar like a rocket, but it made life cleaner, more dignified, and let's face it, a little less unpleasant. That's a humble innovation, a silent companion. And it all began with a folded sheet of plant fiber, tucked beside a Tang Dynasty latrine. In the grand halls of historical innovation, some of the greatest triumphs come not with trumpets, but with a soft rustle. What other quiet inventions have shaped our world, hidden in the background, waiting to be rediscovered? The peasant who outsmarted a dynasty, a straw roof, a wooden hoe, and a quiet rebellion begins. You are in the Jiangxi countryside in the year 1351. The summer air is thick with humidity and the hum of insects. Mud huts line the edges of terrace fields, chickens scratch at the earth, and barefoot children chase dragonflies through narrow footpaths. A thin man, stooped and sun-darkened, moves steadily down a row of millet with his hoe. His straw hat tilts forward, shielding tired eyes from the heat. To the casual observer, he is no one, just another Chinese peasant, indistinguishable from millions of others. But his name is Zhu Yuanzhang, and within 2 decades he will sit on the imperial throne as the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty. Yet this is not the story of a glorious battle, or a triumphant coronation. This is the story of what came before, of famine, loss, desperation, and quiet rebellion. The story of how an orphan with nothing but calloused hands and quiet anger outlasted a dying dynasty. And as you follow his path through backbreaking labor, monastery life, and underground revolution, you will begin to see how empires are not always forged by nobles, but sometimes by the forgotten. The fall of the Yuan when heaven withdrew its mandate. To understand Zhu's world, you must understand what was breaking. The Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, was now nearly a century old. The Mongols had conquered China, but they had not truly ruled it. Their empire, vast and fearsome, had fractured under its own weight. On the countryside, peasants like Zhu faced crushing taxes, grain shortages, and arbitrary abuse by Mongol officials. Droughts swept the plains, locusts followed, then floods, and then, the worst of all, famine. The government, bloated with corruption, ignored it all. The emperor lived in luxury in Dadu, modern-day Beijing, far from the burning villages. Officials lined their pockets, banditry rose. Desperation turned families against one another. Parents sold children. Farmers sold land. Some even ate bark and clay. Zhu Yuanzhen's family was among the forgotten. His father, once a poor tenant farmer, struggled to keep his family fed. His mother grew thin from hunger, her face permanently etched with worry. When a drought wiped out their crops, they lost everything. Then came the plague. Within a few short years, Zhu's parents and elder brothers were dead. At just 16 years old, he was an orphan, alone, hungry, and without a future. He buried them in shallow graves by the side of a dry riverbed. Then he wandered begging for food, sleeping in temples, or beneath trees. He had no shoes, no family, no home. Just a name, and a strange, quiet resolve. The monastery years' words, rice, and the silence of loss. Eventually, starving and desperate, Zhu found shelter at a small Buddhist monastery in Huangjie Temple, near Fangyang, his home village. The monks took him in barely. They gave him chores, rice, and silence. He swept floors, lit incense, and tended the vegetable garden. It was here, in the echoing halls of the temple, that he learned to read. This was not unusual. Buddhist monasteries were among the few places where the poor could access education. But for Zhu, it was transformative. He read sutras, he copied texts. He learned Chinese characters with fingers still blistered from farming. He learned discipline and humility, but also something else: how to observe. He watched pilgrims come and go. He listened to rumors from nearby villages. He learned how politics worked, how anger simmered beneath the surface of peasants and monks alike. But the monastery was poor, and after only a few years, famine returned. The monks could no longer feed all their novices. Zhu, quiet and obedient, was asked to leave. He did not protest. He took his robes, his few scrolls, and walked back into the world. But this time, he was not the same. This time, he had knowledge, and knowledge, he knew now, could be more powerful than swords. The White Lotus, a banner beneath the ashes. By the 1350s, northern China was collapsing. The government could no longer control the countryside. Dozens of rebel groups formed, some violent, others religious. Bandits roamed unchecked. Secret societies plotted. Among the most powerful was the White Lotus Society. Originally a Buddhist sect preaching the coming of the Maitreya Buddha, a savior who would restore balance and peace. It had become a revolutionary movement, disguised as monks and pilgrims. Its members carried messages, gathered weapons, and organized peasants into cells. The White Lotus believed that the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule, had been lost by the Mongols, and they were not alone. Across the land, whispers grew. Heaven is angry. A new emperor will rise. Zhu Yuanzhang, now in his early 20s, joined the movement not out of zealotry, but because he had seen the truth. The Yuan were failing, and someone would have to pick up the pieces. His intelligence and discipline impressed his leaders. He was promoted quickly from foot soldier to organizer, from recruiter to strategist. He traveled from village to village, posing as a monk, stirring dissent, spreading word of the coming revolution. He spoke not with fire but with quiet certainty, and the peasants listened. They had nothing to lose. A different kind of warrior. Unlike many rebel leaders of the time, Zhu was not a warrior by nature. He had no family name, no martial lineage, no army of retainers. What he had was discipline, observation, and an uncanny ability to understand people's motivations. He did not seek glory, he sought order, he sought stability. In a world collapsing, he wanted to restore the old rhythms of rural life, plowing fields, paying fair taxes, sleeping without fear. His troops followed him because he was like them. He wore rough clothes, he shared their food, he listened. Soon he was commanding hundreds, then thousands. He began taking small towns, never with slaughter, but with negotiation, stealth, or starvation. He spared officials who surrendered. He took careful note of grain stores, roads, and irrigation systems. Every village he passed through, he mapped. He wasn't just rebelling, he was preparing to govern. The first real victory, Yingtian. In 1356. Zhu captured the city of Yingshan, today known as Nanjing. It was a turning point. Unlike other rebel leaders who looted and burned, Zhu stabilized the city. He reopened the markets, He protected scholars and merchants. He built dikes, repaired roads, and reopened schools. People noticed. Refugees poured in. Former Yuan officials quietly offered their services. Even rival rebel groups began to respect him. Zhu was no longer just a rebel monk. He was becoming something else, a leader, perhaps even a ruler. And yet, he remained cautious. He still operated under the banner of the White Lotus. He still paid homage publicly to their messianic figurehead. But privately, he was planning something different. He was not waiting for Maitreya. He was building something real. The land of ashes by now. China was a patchwork of warlords, rebels, bandits, and collapsing Yuan garrisons. The Mongol rulers in Dardu had become ghosts, unseen, uncaring, unreachable. Their armies were weakened by infighting and starvation. Their grip on the south was gone. Cities burned. Entire counties had no officials. Roads vanished under weeds. And through this landscape of ruin, Zhu moved like a farmer walking a broken field, carefully, deliberately, planting seeds. He married the daughter of one of his trusted commanders, a woman known to history as Empress Ma, though at the time she was simply the quiet, clever daughter of a loyal general. Their partnership would shape the new dynasty's early years. Zhu surrounded himself with capable men, scholars, strategists, engineers. He asked questions, listened more than he spoke, and never forgot what it felt like to beg for food in the street. He kept his army fed. He kept his city stable. He avoided waste and looting. And slowly, methodically, he began to clear the land like a farmer preparing for the next season. Could a man born in a thatched hut, orphaned by famine, and hardened by temple silence truly forge a new dynasty? Could he survive the rival warlords circling like wolves and keep his vision alive? The trial begins. Bones on the throne. The soft sunlight filtered through the cracked stained glass windows of the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome, casting fragmented hues of red and blue across the worn stone floors. The massive church, seat of the Bishop of Rome, was rarely empty, but today it was full in a different way, not with prayerful worshippers, but with witnesses, judges, bishops, nobles, and curious onlookers, all drawn by the unprecedented spectacle about to unfold. It was January of 897 CE, a cold Roman morning, and Pope Stephen VI stood before a throne. But this was no ordinary throne of judgment. Seated stiffly upon it was his predecessor, Pope Formosus, dead for nearly 9 months. Yes, dead, dug from his grave, clothed in papal vestments, and propped up in ceremonial dignity. The former pope had been placed on trial. Literally, the world was about to witness the cadaver synod, or synodus horrenda, as it would be recorded later. It remains, to this day, one of the most macabre moments in the entire history of the Catholic Church, and one that perfectly illustrates how politics, power, and paranoia could override even the boundaries between life and death. The setting: Rome in chaos. To truly understand the absurdity of what happened next, one must look again at the backdrop. Pope Stephen VI, once a protege of the powerful Duke of Spoleto, was now trying to navigate Rome in a time of increasing instability. The Carolingian Empire had fractured. The papacy, once a symbol of spiritual authority, had become a pawn on the chessboard of noble families. The Holy See changed hands frequently. Popes were elevated, then deposed or murdered, often within months. Trust in divine legitimacy was replaced by the fear of factional betrayal. Formosus, who had held the papal seat from 891 to 896, had made many enemies during his reign. Notably, he had supported Arnulf of Carinthia over Lambert of Spain as Holy Roman Emperor. This had angered the Speletons, including Lambert's formidable mother After Formosus's death, a brief and uneventful reign by Pope Boniface VI himself, possibly poisoned or forcibly removed, was followed by Stephen V's elevation, likely with Spoleto support. So, when Stephen put Formosus's corpse on trial, he wasn't acting out of theological necessity. He was performing political theater, a grotesque performance meant to erase Formosus's influence and delegitimize all he had done, including ordinations and political alliances. The trial begins. The corpse was propped up on a throne and, draped in the papal pallium behind its lifeless eye sockets, Formosus's remains had stiffened and decayed. Some say they tied his body together with cords or propped it internally with straw or reeds to keep it upright. Whether this detail is true or exaggerated by later chroniclers, the fact remains: a lifeless pope was seated in judgment. Stephen VI, acting as prosecutor, demanded answers. Of course, Formosus could not reply, so a deacon was appointed to answer on his behalf. This man stood beside the cadaver, occasionally turning toward it as if consulting a mute witness, then responding with prepared lines that ranged from hollow defenses to vacant denials. The charges, perjury, that Formosus had broken an oath not to return to Rome or seek higher ecclesiastical office, an oath allegedly made during his time as Bishop of Porto, ambition, that he had schemed to attain the papacy illegitimately, transgression of canon law, that he had illegally transferred sees by being bishop of two places simultaneously, Porto and Rome. These were not unheard of accusations in the annals of church politics, but trying a dead man for them, that was unique. Bishops, both local and foreign, sat in solemn attention. Some were horrified, others were delighted, many simply stared at the spectacle unfolding. Imagine the echoing voice of Stephen reverberating across the basilica walls, his anger directed at a mummified shell, his hands gestured, his mouth foamed, his tone rising and falling in righteous rage. And across from him, the deacon gently turned toward a cadaver dressed in ceremonial white and gold, then murmured a dry no or yes on its behalf. It is difficult to say whether Stephen truly believed Formosus had sinned grievously enough to warrant this medieval pantomime, or if he was simply performing for his backers, the Speletons and their allies who wished to scrub Formosus from church memory. Perhaps it was both. In an era when relics were believed to possess power and bodies of saints could work miracles, a dead pope might still hold authority. In that view, condemning the corpse might indeed revoke his works and blessings. The verdict. After hours of surreal deliberation, the verdict came guilty of all charges, and with that, a flurry of grotesque punishments were ordered. The papal garments were torn from the corpse, the 3 fingers Formosus had used to give blessings. The benedictory fingers were cut off. His body was stripped naked and dragged unceremoniously through the later and. Eventually, it was thrown into a pauper's grave. Later, it would be dug up again, this time by a mob, and hurled into the Tiber River. Stephen VI had succeeded. He had not just condemned a rival, he had erased him for a moment. Whispers of discomfort. But even in those days, some in Rome were unsettled. The desecration of a pope's body, the dramatization of a corpse's trial, and the grotesque mutilation of remains pushed many to question Stephen's sanity. Whispers circulated. Was this justice, or desecration? Were these holy men, or power-hungry madmen cloaked in priestly garb? Bishops who had once supported the trial began to waver. Laypeople who had watched out of curiosity now spoke of curses and omens. After all, the Tiber had flooded not long after the body was tossed in. Was it a sign? Formosus in death had become more than a pope. He was now a symbol of political vengeance, of sacrilege, or perhaps of something deeper. How fragile both sanctity and legacy truly were as the days passed. Pope Stephen VI, once triumphant, began to unravel. The spectacle he'd orchestrated had shocked even a weary and cynical Rome. So, what happened to him? That is the final chapter in this tale. But how could such a trial affect a man of Stephen's power? Could a dead man's curse, or the turning tides of politics, bring down a living pope? The IBM after Genghis, horses, corruption, and the slow fade into obscurity. After the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, the Mongol Empire was at its peak, stretching from the Pacific Ocean in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west. Though succession disputes loomed, the machine of empire had already been set in motion, largely due to the infrastructure Genghis had left behind. And at the heart of that infrastructure was the IBM, the mighty postal system of mounted couriers, relay stations, and an empire held together by hoof beats. In this final section of our story, we turn our gaze toward the evolution, exploitation, and eventual decline of this network. What once tied a sprawling empire together with the elegance of silk threads began to fray under the weight of politics, greed, and changing times. Gedai, Genghis Khan's third son and chosen successor, knew the value of the postal system. Under his rule, the IBM expanded rapidly. Some historians believe it doubled in reach. He saw it not just as a military asset, but a bureaucratic lifeline, allowing the empire to communicate across distances that would otherwise take months to traverse. He increased the number of relay stations, reportedly building over 1,400 across Central Asia and the Chinese heartland. Each was now equipped with guest houses, fodder supplies, and blacksmiths to maintain horses intact. By the 1240s, you could, in theory, send a message from Karakoram to Baghdad, and expect a response within weeks, not years. Gedai also formalized what had previously been an ad hoc system of paysers, the medallions that gave riders and officials access to the IBM. These gold and silver tablets were now engraved with imperial decrees, outlining the bearer's rights. Some were even signed by the Kagan himself. But while the IBM became more efficient, it also became more centralized, and with that came new opportunities for abuse. What happens when everyone wants a VIP pass? The paisa, once an emblem of statecraft, became something of a status symbol. Under later Khans, especially during the reign of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, the issuance of paisas became more frequent. Kublai, based in China and ruling the Yuan dynasty, continued to rely heavily on the IBM, especially to connect with his territories in Persia and Russia. But he also needed to appease nobles, foreign allies, and bureaucrats. To curry favor, he granted paisas generously. Some were given to European emissaries, notably Marco Polo, whose family reportedly received a gold paisa, enabling them to travel safely through the Mongol world. Others were handed to Persian administrators, Chinese ministers, and even merchant guilds. With so many in circulation, the integrity of the system began to waver. Stations were overburdened, resources strained, and the quality of horses deteriorated. Even worse, forgeries appeared in unsanctioned paisas that gave anyone with a bit of silver and a craftsman access to imperial privilege. The IBM, once designed for military precision and state communication, began to serve private traders, corrupt officials, and those who had nothing to do with statecraft. Operating the IBM wasn't cheap. While the system was centrally coordinated, much of the maintenance fell on local villages. Communities near a relay station were required to provide labor, fodder, water, and food. At first, this was seen as a form of imperial service, a civic duty with some honor attached. But as the number of paisa holders rose and the volume of traffic increased, these expectations grew unbearable. Horses were overused, forage depleted, and peasants forced into unpaid labor. Many had to give up their own working animals to satisfy IBM demands. And because of the prestige associated with the paisa, refusal was not an option. Reports from Persia and parts of northern China describe communities who abandoned farmland near relay roads to escape the burden. These were not isolated instances. They formed part of a systemic erosion of rural stability. In time, this economic strain would turn the IBM from a lifeline into a source of resentment. By the early 1300s, the once unified Mongol Empire had fractured into four khanates: the Yuan in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia. Each khanate inherited part of the postal system, but without centralized coordination, the efficiency collapsed. Some regions adapted the IBM for their own uses, but standardization vanished. The Ilkhanate in Persia maintained a relatively strong system under rulers like Ghazan Khan, who tried to reform and standardize routes. Ghazan even ordered stone markers placed at relay stations and tried to reassert control over paisa issuance. But his reforms came late, and following his death, the Ilkhanate unraveled. The Yuan dynasty tried to modernize the IBM further by incorporating paper money logistics, connecting it to taxation and census taking. But again, the system suffered under the weight of bureaucratic corruption and incompetent governance. Meanwhile, the Chagatai and Golden Horde khanates, more fractured and tribal in nature, allowed their portions of the system to deteriorate, reverting to more localized couriers and eliminating long-distance coordination. By the 1360s, the IBM was a patchwork of fading paths, overgrown roads, crumbling stations, and half-fed horses still used, but without the majesty or cohesion of Genghis's design. Despite its decline, the Mongol postal system left behind a remarkable institutional legacy. Later empires, including the Russian Zadam, Safavid, Persia, and even the Ottoman Empire, adopted similar courier systems, often directly inspired by Mongol practices. Indra Shah, the Yam system, same root word, became part of the Tsarist postal network. Its influence can be traced through linguistic remnants, administrative structures, and even the imperial relay chains used by later European empires. What's more striking is how the IBM demonstrated that connectivity, not conquest, was the real heart of the empire. Without it, orders could not be sent, taxes could not be collected, and armies could not be fed. It was not the arrows that held the Mongol world together, but the horses between them. Why is it that this vast, efficient, almost miraculous system of communication is so rarely remembered today? Perhaps because it was logistical, not theatrical. It didn't involve great battles or famous speeches. It functioned best when it was invisible, when messages flowed without delay, when no one had to think about how information arrived, only that it did. In a world obsessed with kings, wars, and revolutions, the quiet discipline of couriers and the dull thud of hooves in the night might seem unworthy of historical drama, but maybe, just maybe, that's the wrong way to look at it, because for 100 years, the Mongol IBM turned an impossible empire into a functioning reality. And all it took was a network of men, horses, and the will to stay moving no matter the cost. Story 3. The candle tax and the collapse of medieval illumination. When light was a luxury, you live in a world where light is available at the flick of a switch. The idea of sitting in complete darkness for hours each evening, doing nothing but waiting for the sun to rise, seems primitive. But in the medieval world, this was the norm. Not only because artificial lighting was inefficient, but because it was expensive. Very expensive. And then came a tax. It was the year 1709 when Queen Anne's Parliament imposed a new excise on a domestic staple, candles. This wasn't the first time that light had become a matter of political and economic control, but it was one of the most consequential for the average English household. By the time this candle tax reached full implementation, it would help shape social class distinctions, define public versus private space, and even accelerate changes in labor patterns and sleeping habits. But to understand how candlelight became a taxable luxury, we must begin much earlier. Let's go back to the early Middle Ages. Long before Queen Anne, the daily rhythms of medieval life were inextricably linked to the sun. Farmers rose with it, merchants opened their stores by it, and monks prayed according to it. The absence of natural light didn't just bring inconvenience, it brought fear, uncertainty, and the loss of productivity. Candlelight, at this point, was a privilege of the clergy and the very wealthy. Your average peasant, living in a one-room Waterlandorp hut, likely went to bed as darkness fell. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat emitted a thick, unpleasant smoke and a smell that clung to fabric and hair. They sputtered and burned unevenly, lasting only a few hours. A family might use one per night, if they could afford it, or none at all. Wax candles, with their clean burning flame and sweet scent, were reserved for churches and noble households. Beeswax was precious, and a symbol of wealth. And yet, despite the expense and scarcity of candles, illumination played a vital role in religious and political rituals. The Catholic Church's elaborate ceremonies were drenched in symbolic light. Candle processions, altar flames, and vigil lamps all reinforced spiritual hierarchy. Royal courts used candles to demonstrate luxury and divine favor. In a world mostly dark, to control light was to control power. As Europe entered the High Middle Ages, urban centers expanded, trade flourished, and a new middle class emerged. These merchants and artisans were not nobles, but they weren't peasants either. They needed light both to work in their shops and to educate their children. Candle use, once the preserve of lords and abbots, slowly crept downward. But light remained costly, so what happens when something becomes both essential and expensive? It becomes taxable. Enter the 18th century and the British government's growing hunger for revenue. Britain was deeply involved in continental wars, and in need of funds to support its military efforts. Parliament saw the everyday use of candles as a dependable, widespread source of income. In 1709, a formal duty on candles was introduced. This law required candlemakers to obtain licenses and pay for them. Private individuals were forbidden from making their own candles without also acquiring a license, an expensive and rarely granted privilege. The logic was simple. Nearly every household used candles, and unlike wine or lace or silk, candles were essential, not luxury. Taxing them would bring in steady revenue, and the effort to regulate them would encourage legal oversight of a rapidly growing informal economy. But it also did something else. It plunged working-class homes back into darkness. The cost of candles rose significantly. A candle that once sold for a penny might now cost 3. Those who previously lit a single candle for dinner might now choose to eat in near darkness. Poor families returned to using rushlights, dried rushes soaked in fat, or even strips of burning wood. These provided a flickering, smoky light and had to be constantly attended. In the countryside, some families even used pine knots. Their resinous glow enough to read by, though barely. But more than discomfort, the candle tax reshaped the rhythms of life. As homes darkened earlier in the evening, families adjusted. The second sleep phenomenon, where people slept in 2 segments with a waking period in between, became even more common. In wealthier homes, nighttime was a time of reading, socialization, and quiet contemplation. In poorer households, it became a time of silence and stillness. Those who could not afford candles also struggled to educate their children. Nighttime reading or writing became limited to daylight hours, reinforcing class disparities in literacy. The candle tax, in its quiet persistence, deepened the line between those who could afford to extend their day and those who couldn't. The effect was also visible in industry. Artisans and apprentices often relied on natural light to complete their work. When working hours were shortened by the candle tax, output suffered. Some workshops shifted their hours earlier, while others simply accepted reduced productivity. In the winter months, entire industries slowed to a crawl due to limited illumination. In cities, taverns and inns bore the brunt. Customers accustomed to lingering after dusk were now served in smoky, dimly lit rooms. Business declined in some quarters. In others, tavern owners skirted the rules by burning multiple smaller rushlights or hiding unlicensed candles behind curtains and panels. But if discovered, the penalties were severe fines, seizures, or even jail time. The tax also gave rise to a new class of petty informants, men and women, who reported neighbors for making candles without licenses. Some were motivated by civic duty, others by jealousy, and still more by the promise of reward. Community trust eroded, and light, once a communal necessity, became a symbol of suspicion and state control. Even more absurd was the emergence of candle inspectors and government officials tasked with checking weights, ingredients, and taxes. On candle production, stories spread of inspectors bursting into kitchens, sniffing at burning tapers, and demanding receipts for homemade candles. In some places, people deliberately darkened their windows to avoid suspicion, giving rise to rumors of witchcraft and dissent. Of course, not everyone suffered equally. In grand country houses, candles burned in dozens, sometimes hundreds during feasts and balls. Wax chandeliers gleamed above guests in powdered wigs and satin gloves. The display of artificial light became a kind of arms race among the elite. It signaled wealth, confidence, and sophistication. For the poor, however, candles became the symbol of absence, what they could not afford, what they had once taken for granted, and what the government had now made forbidden. Even churches, long havens of communal light, began limiting the number of lit candles during evening mass or vigils. And yet, the candle tax persisted for over a century. It remained until 1831, long after gaslighting had begun to appear in urban centers. For many, its removal came too late. Habits had changed. Entire generations had grown up with an ingrained caution toward light. The question remains, what happens to a society when light becomes a commodity rather than a right? When something as elemental as the flame of a candle is regulated by the state? When illumination is not only about fire but about class, power, and control? Tolls, tariffs, and the peasants' lament. As the 11th century gave way to the 12th. The dirt-packed roads of Europe bore heavier burdens, not just in the wagons that creaked across them, but in the tolls extracted at every bend, bridge, and border. If the Roman roads had once been arteries of a grand empire, now the arteries were clogged with inefficiencies, political fragmentation, and opportunistic lords. In this section, we explore the complexity of toll collection during the High Middle Ages, an often overlooked but deeply influential part of feudal economic life. As mundane as it may seem, the cost of moving a bag of wool from one village to the next could determine whether a town prospered or withered, whether a merchant thrived or faded, and in the grander view, whether a kingdom could afford war or peace. By the time Charlemagne's empire had fractured into a patchwork of competing fiefdoms and duchy, the road network had become less an imperial utility and more a source of local revenue. Landowners, especially those controlling river crossings and trade routes, began charging passage dues, initially under the justification of maintaining the roads or offering protection from bandits. These were called pontage for bridges, moorage for city walls, pavage for paving roads, and stallage for market spaces. But these charges quickly evolved into a system ripe for exploitation. Local lords saw tolls not as a duty, but a divine right, an extension of their control over land and people. At one poorly documented point, a single merchant transporting salt from Toulon to Paris might have had to stop at over 30 toll stations, paying a portion of his goods or coin at each. Fees were rarely standard and often arbitrary. The Holy Roman Empire was infamous for this. The Rhine River alone had dozens of robber barons by the 13th century, each collecting tolls at castles perched above the water. Despite imperial edicts attempting to curb the practice, these tools remained a persistent barrier to trade and communication. The toll booth itself was not the simple wooden shack you might imagine. In cities like Cologne or Dijon, toll collectors worked in elaborately constructed gatehouses. Toll officers were literate men, often clerics or city-appointed officials who maintained ledgers, issued receipts on parchment, and sometimes even had jurisdiction over minor legal disputes. The records, though dull in appearance, paint vivid pictures of economic life. How many carts of hay passed through in a week? Which merchants brought saffron from Iberia? Who transported dried fish from the Baltic? In these scribbled accounts, we see early documentation of a growing network of commerce struggling under bureaucratic burden. Sometimes goods were taxed not by weight or volume, but by perceived value. One record from 1272 notes a merchant charged 3 times more for a bolt of silk than for a cartload of onions. When challenged, the toll officer wrote tersely, "Silk may be stolen, onions cannot." Yet it wasn't always about goods. Pedestrians, too, were taxed in some areas. A peasant, with a cartload of firewood, a monk on foot, or a group of pilgrims each might be asked for coin or even labor. A particularly notorious route in Burgundy demanded that pilgrims en route to Santiago de Compostela offer a candle or a day's work repairing potholes. The ones who suffered most, predictably, were not the noble merchants or state messengers, but the peasants and small traders. Imagine a woman named Isabel living in a hamlet near the Loire River, who makes extra coins selling cheese in the market 2 towns over. To reach it, she must cross a narrow bridge maintained by a local monastery. The toll, paid in cheese wheels or eggs, is steep. Her return journey may involve giving a portion of her earnings to a local bailiff for using the village road, and if it rains, and the roads flood, she may have to take a detour through the lands of another baron who demands soil duty, payment for trampling his earth. This grinding bureaucracy disincentivized small traders from expanding. Most villagers rarely traveled beyond a few miles from their homes, not for fear of getting lost, but for fear of being taxed into destitution. Despite this, many kept moving. Trade was life, and with trade came gradual, creeping change. By the late 13th century, some cities and regions began to chafe under the weight of tolls. Urban centers like Bruges, Ghent, and Lübeck formed leagues and alliances, asserting greater autonomy over roadways and reducing redundant toll points. The most famous of these was the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe, a coalition of merchant cities that sought to secure their trade routes from both pirates and extortionate toll collectors. In England, Edward I attempted to centralize toll collection under the crown. While the effort was partly successful in consolidating revenue, it failed to address the underlying issue. Local lords and abbots still claimed hereditary toll rights. Conflicts emerged. Some townspeople, emboldened by urban charters, physically tore down toll barriers or refused to pay, leading to small-scale skirmishes and bitter legal disputes. One case from 1295 recounts a group of English tanners in Leicester staging a protest by herding dozens of oxen through a toll station without stopping. When challenged, they cited a forgotten clause in a charter granted to King's Prior that exempted all tradesmen of Leather-Yard from such fees. The toll officer, unsure, let them pass but sent a furious letter to his superior. These small acts of defiance chipped away at feudal control. Despite the power they wielded, toll collectors lived largely forgettable lives. In surviving letters and records, their concerns are mundane: a broken scale, a sick donkey, unpaid wages, accusations of pocketing fees. A letter dated 1322 from a toll clerk near the Pyrenees reads to Master Roger, "I write to inform you that the miller from Barrett's Hollow has passed thrice without coin and threatens the watchman with cudgel. I am without guard and fear for my post. May the Lord intervene." Such accounts, while seemingly dull, reveal the fragility of local authority and the bureaucratic anxieties that haunted even the lowest rungs of administration. Some toll officers were respected, others were hated. They were often caught between enforcing the demands of their lord and navigating the tempers of common folk. Some resorted to corruption, others turned informant for rebellious towns. The job was hardly glamorous, but it shaped the very pulse of the realm. One unexpected consequence of toll bureaucracy was its impact on border formation. Because tolls marked territorial claims, disputes often erupted over where one lord's jurisdiction ended and another's began. On one prolonged dispute along the Danube, rival bishops argued for decades over which branch of the river marked their domain. Their toll ledgers became exhibits in court used to prove continuous administration of trade, and thus rightful ownership. The case settled only after the papal nuncio intervened. left both sides poorer but established a legal precedent still cited a century later. It's a sobering reminder that even boring, dusty receipts can wield geopolitical power to modern eyes. This web of tolls and tariffs may seem absurd. Why not simplify it? Why not build better roads and open trade? But to those living it, tolls were not merely obstacles, they were facts of life, much like rain or plague. They were baked into the rhythm of commerce, grudgingly accepted and often feared. And yet, they shaped everything. The wealth of Venice and Genoa, the stagnation of isolated villages, the rise of urban leagues and the first stirrings of proto-parliaments, all of it flowing along the ruts and potholes of dusty roads, pausing at gatehouses manned by men with ink-stained fingers and ledgers full of numbers no one remembers. And so, as the 14th century approached, kingdoms began to wrestle with a question that was deceptively dull yet powerfully important. If a nation cannot move freely within itself, can it ever truly grow? The book that tamed a kingdom. By the time William the Conqueror reached the final stages of his rule, England was a very different land than the one he had taken by force in 1066. The Norman administration had carved out its imprint in stone, and silenced monasteries rebuilt, fortresses razed, and native earls replaced. Yet, one project would come to symbolize the totality of his grasp on the kingdom, a vast ledger so detailed, so peculiar, and so definitive that no subsequent ruler could ignore its contents. The Doomsday Book was not a book in the modern sense, and its compilation was as immense an undertaking as the conquest itself. It was not designed to inspire, nor to entertain, nor even to educate. It was meant, rather plainly, to control. And so we come to the final chapter of this history, not of a battle nor of a coronation, but of a survey, a list, and a ledger that changed the way medieval power was managed forever. The entire effort required a coordination of astonishing breadth. In January 1086, at Christmas Court in Gloucester, William summoned his leading barons and bishops. It was here that he reportedly declared the need to account for every inch of land, every ox, and every peasant under his rule. To accomplish this, the king appointed royal commissioners, trusted men, many of whom were clergy, because they were among the few who could read and write Latin, the language in which the Doomsday Book would be penned. These commissioners fanned out across England in groups. Each was assigned one or more counties, and they followed a remarkably standardized line of questioning. What they asked, though seemingly simple, would make even the hardiest reeve sweat. What is the name of the manor? Who held it in the time of King Edward before the conquest? Who holds it now? How many hides a measurement of land? How many plows, both lords and men's? How many villagers, smallholders, slaves? How much woodland, meadow, and pasture? How many mills, fisheries, or other sources of revenue? How much was it worth before 1066, and how much now? The inquisitiveness of the process was so extreme that some records suggest the commissioners asked whether the land could have yielded even more. The questions were not theoretical, they were about exploitation, optimization, and taxation. Yet perhaps the most radical aspect of the survey was its inclusion of the peasants themselves. The villeins, borders, and cotters, terms for varying levels of unfree peasants, were named and counted. The Doomsday Book, in essence, recorded the entire social pyramid, from the highest magnate to the humblest swineherd. One key mechanism that made the survey effective was the use of juries. For each manor or hundred or subdivision of a county, the commissioners summoned local jurors, usually a mix of Normans and Anglos. They were required to swear oaths to tell the truth and answer all questions accurately. If disputes arose, which they often did, the discrepancies were noted. This process ensured two things. First, that the information was not solely dictated by the landholder, who had every reason to downplay his holdings. Second, that the local population was involved, thus providing cross-verification. Still, the air of fear was palpable. One account from the Peterborough Chronicle, a contemporary Anglo-Saxon record, captures the mood succinctly. So very narrowly did he, William, have it investigated that there was not a single hide, nor a yard of land, nor even, it is shameful to tell, but it seemed no shame for him to do an ox, nor a cow, nor a pig that was not set down in the book. This was not administrative tidiness for its own sake. William was no idealist. The Doomsday Book was designed to support a system of taxation, conscription, and fealty that could not be escaped. In an age when oral memory governed law and lineage, writing it all down granted terrifying permanence. The final product, actually 2 books, was compiled at Winchester. The larger volume, known today as Great Doomsday, covered most of England, A smaller one, Little Doomsday, included the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex. Oddly, Little Doomsday is more detailed, leading some historians to believe that its style was deemed too cumbersome to reproduce across the entire kingdom. There is no definitive answer as to why these three counties were treated differently. Some suggest that William had intended to compile the entire realm in such detail, but either lost interest or died before it could be completed. The entries are, by modern standards, dry, but the scope is staggering. Over 13,000 settlements are listed. Approximately 268,984 people are estimated to have been recorded, a significant portion of England's population at the time. The record includes 6,000 mills, hundreds of churches, and more than 1,000 markets. Even foreign holdings, lands owned by Norman abbeys or French lords, were detailed. The survey made it clear that no portion of land, no matter how obscure or ecclesiastical, was beyond the king's view. So why is it called the Domesday Book? The name came later. Originally it was known simply as the Book of Winchester, or King's Book. The term Doomsday, referencing the Day of Judgment, began to circulate because of the book's inescapable authority. Once something was written in it, it could not be changed. To the medieval mind, it was like the final reckoning of souls, except, in this case, it was a reckoning of sheep and silver. In fact, the Doomsday Book was so feared that it continued to be cited in legal disputes. For centuries, land ownership arguments, taxation cases, even noble lineages were all drawn back to the cold, papery ledger penned in 1086. The original manuscript still survives in the UK National Archives, written in dense Latin script on parchment made from animal skin. William the Conqueror died in 1087, only a year after the Domesday Book was completed. He did not live to see the full extent of its influence. His son, William Rufus, and future kings would use it to levy taxes, resolve disputes, and assert royal authority. Ironically, it is not the castles or the conquests that mark the true extent of William's impact on England. It is the Domesday Book, that silent, unassuming manuscript, that continues to echo across the centuries. Unlike other monuments to power, this one required no stone, no sword, and no sanctification. It needed only ink, parchment, and an unwavering desire to know and control everything. And so, the Domesday Book did not merely describe a kingdom, it became the kingdom, in a sense. It turned landscape into language, power into paper. But one final question remains. How would history have changed if the Domesday Book had not been written, if power had remained unwritten, invisible, and ephemeral? Would England have become something altogether different? Story 4, The Silent Siege. Life inside the walls of the 100 Years. Siege of Calais, a city on edge. The calm before the starvation. Imagine yourself in Calais, a small port city on the northern coast of France, in the year 1346. The air is heavy with salt and anticipation. You stand inside ancient stone walls that have sheltered generations, yet you know these walls will soon be tested unlike ever before. This is the start of what will become one of the longest and most harrowing sieges in medieval history, stretching over a full year during the infamous 100 Years' War between England and France. But the story of Calais is not a tale of dramatic battles and heroic charges. Instead, it's a slow, grinding endurance of hunger, disease, fear, and political calculation. Let us step quietly through the streets, courtyards, and kitchens of Calais in 1346, to witness a siege waged, not with swords, but with patience and deprivation, and learn how ordinary people survived in the shadow of war. To understand why Calais mattered, one must think like a medieval general. The English king, Edward III, had declared himself rightful heir to the French throne, plunging both kingdoms into what would be decades of conflict. Control of coastal towns like Calais was vital for trade, supply lines, and launching future military campaigns. Calais sat on a narrow strip of land projecting into the English Channel, a gateway between England and continental Europe. Its port facilities made it a key hub for commerce and naval movement. For Edward, taking Calais meant a secure foothold on French soil and a permanent base to launch raids or invasions. For the French king, holding Calais was essential to maintaining control over the northern coastline and blocking English advances. In the summer of 1346, after months of campaigning, Edward's army arrived before Calais with thousands of soldiers, archers, and engineers. The city's defenders were well aware of the English presence and the looming threat. Inside the walls, the city prepared quietly, stockpiling food, reinforcing defenses, and bracing for what would become a siege that tested the limits of human Endurance. The citizens of Calais were a mix of merchants, craftsmen, laborers, soldiers, and clergy. Their daily lives revolved around the routines of medieval urban living, baking bread, mending sails, trading wool, and attending to the small churches dotting the city. Though there was an undercurrent of anxiety, outwardly, life moved on much. As before, markets were open during the day, and children played in the alleys. The city council held meetings to organize defenses, negotiate supplies, and maintain order. The walls, centuries old, had been reinforced in recent years, but were not impenetrable. Watchmen scanned the horizon for signs of English ships or scouts. The city's garrison, led by the governor, was a mix of seasoned soldiers and local militia. Stockpiles of grain and salted meat were carefully rationed, as the leaders knew that a prolonged siege would mean starvation. Wells inside the city provided fresh water, though there was always concern about contamination or sabotage. Once the English encircled Calais, the city's fate was effectively sealed. Edward's forces constructed earthen mounds and siege engines, cutting off supply routes and tightening the noose for the citizens. The initial weeks brought a slow but inexorable transformation of daily life. Markets began to empty as merchants were unable to bring in fresh goods. Prices soared for what little food remained, and desperation began to settle in. The city council imposed rationing, prioritizing soldiers and key workers. Ordinary families had to stretch meager rations, often eating gruel or roots gathered from nearby fields. Some resorted to eating horses, dogs, and vermin. Disease became a constant threat. Overcrowding inside the walls, combined with poor sanitation and weakened immune systems, allowed illness to spread. Fever, dysentery, and respiratory ailments took many, often without adequate care. Amid the quiet despair, however, moments of human kindness and resilience persisted. Neighbors shared what little they had. Priests offered solace and prayers. Children adapted, playing games with found objects or listening to stories of better days, while physical survival was paramount. The siege also wore down the minds and spirits of Calais' inhabitants. The fear of betrayal, rumors of mutiny, and uncertainty about the outside world created an atmosphere thick with suspicion. Some citizens whispered about secret negotiations. Others feared that English sympathizers within the city would open the gates. Guard posts became sites of tension, with watchmen eyeing each other warily. Despite this, public order was maintained, partly through the determined leadership of the city's governor, who balanced strict discipline with encouragement. The people's resilience was a quiet force, one measured not by battles, but by enduring hardship day after day without surrendering their will to survive. Unresolved questions. What price would the city pay? As the siege dragged into its later months, food grew scarcer, sickness spread wider, and morale flagged. The city's walls protected its people from arrows and swords, but not from hunger and despair. How long could Calais hold out? Would the French king send relief? Would the English grow weary or ruthless? And what of the civilians caught in the middle? Would their loyalty to their city endure or fracture under the crushing weight of starvation? These questions hung in the smoky air over Calais as the months stretched on, a silent drumbeat to a siege waged in shadows and silence. Hunger and hardship, the slow collapse of a city. When Edward III's forces settled around Calais in September 1346, the city's defenders understood immediately that they were trapped. The English army, well organized and supplied, began methodically, tightening their grip, blocking every road, river, and trail that connected the city to the outside world. Inside the walls, the mood darkened. The siege was no longer a distant threat, but an immediate and cruel reality. Over the next many months, life in Calais became a relentless test of endurance, survival, and the limits of human patience. Before the siege, Calais had enjoyed relatively steady trade. Its port buzzed with merchants bringing grains, salted fish, wool, and wine. The city's granaries were reasonably stocked enough for several months, if rationed carefully. But a siege disrupts not just the flow of goods, but also the natural rhythms of replenishment. Traders fled, farms outside the walls were abandoned or pillaged, and local hunters found their grounds cut off. By late autumn, the first signs of scarcity appeared. Bakers rationed flour tightly, often mixing it with bran or other fillers to stretch supplies. The city council enforced strict rationing orders, prioritizing soldiers and officials while urging civilians to limit consumption. Families that once ate 3 meals a day shifted to 1. Bread grew harder and drier and fresh. Vegetables disappeared from tables. The once common ale made from barley and water was diluted beyond recognition or abandoned altogether. As winter deepened, hunting and foraging became increasingly impossible. The surrounding fields lay barren, covered in frost or snow. Food prices skyrocketed in the city's black market, where desperation bred both opportunity and cruelty. Starvation forced citizens to resort to food sources previously considered unacceptable or taboo. Reports from the siege describe widespread consumption of horses, dogs, and even rats. Horses, once prized for transport and war, were slaughtered for meat. Eating horseflesh was culturally frowned upon, but accepted out of necessity. Similarly, dogs, companions, and watchdogs became a food source, adding to the mental anguish of their owners. Rats and mice, plentiful in the city's cramped quarters, were caught and eaten, often roasted or boiled with herbs if any were available. There are even accounts of individuals eating bark, roots, and unripe seeds gathered secretly from the city's few green spaces. These drastic measures, however, could only delay the inevitable. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making them vulnerable to disease. The siege's physical toll extended beyond hunger. Overcrowded conditions, combined with malnutrition, created a breeding ground for disease. The city's sewage and waste disposal systems, never designed for prolonged confinement, quickly failed. Human and animal waste accumulated in streets and alleys, contaminating water supplies. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections swept through the population. The city's limited medical knowledge meant treatments were rudimentary herbs, prayers, and sometimes bloodletting. Hospitals and churches struggled to cope with the sick and dying. Their resources stretched to breaking. The psychological effects of illness compounded suffering. Families watched loved ones waste away, often unable to provide comfort or care. As the siege dragged on, social tensions within Calais became more pronounced. The wealthy, who had stocked more food initially, tried to protect their supplies, sometimes hoarding or trading at inflated prices. The poor bore the brunt of hardship, and often accused city leaders of favoritism or corruption. Discontent simmered in taverns, homes, and even among the city guards. The governor and council worked to maintain order through curfews, patrols, and rationing enforcement, but whispers of dissent were impossible to suppress entirely. Meanwhile, a small but significant faction within the city considered surrender or negotiation, fearing total annihilation. The question of loyalty was ever present. Should Calais hold out for the French king's relief or seek terms with the English besiegers? Throughout the siege, both sides engaged in cautious diplomacy. The English wanted Calais' surrender but were wary of unnecessary bloodshed or damage that could reduce the city's value. Messengers and spies moved covertly, attempting to carry news and proposals. Calais' leaders sent appeals to King Philip VI of France, begging for reinforcements or supplies. The French king responded by gathering armies and attempting relief efforts, but these were repeatedly repelled or diverted. For the citizens, hope fluctuated, sometimes buoyed by rumors of approaching French armies, other times crushed by news of defeat elsewhere. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the siege was its assault on morale. The long nights spent in cold, dark, and hunger tested not just bodies but souls. Religious services, led by the clergy, became both solace and ritual, reinforcing faith amidst despair. Neighbors comforted one another, sharing stories, food, and warmth. Children adapteth, inventing games and songs to distract themselves. Yet, as weeks turned to months, exhaustion and despair deepened. Would Calais survive the winter? Would the English break through the walls or force surrender by attrition? The city's fate hung in balance, as silent and unyielding as the stone walls themselves. The fall and its aftermath: sacrifice, submission, and survival. After nearly a year encircled by the English army, the city of Calais found itself at the breaking point. The relentless siege had ground down its people through starvation, disease, and despair. The once bustling port was a shadow of itself. Streets were empty, markets closed, and the fortifications, though still standing, barely held back the weight of exhaustion pressing within. This final section takes us through the poignant last days of the siege, the acts of sacrifice and negotiation that decided Calais' fate, and the profound legacy that shaped its future. For generations. By August 1347, the toll of the siege was undeniable. Rations had dwindled to nearly nothing. The weakened population, suffering from famine and sickness, faced starvation. Reports from chroniclers described desperate measures: people begging in the streets, scavenging refuse, and trading their last valuables for morsels of food. The city's walls, though formidable, had no magic to replenish what was lost inside. Even the soldiers grew gaunt, their arms too weak for battle. The council and military leaders convened repeatedly, weighing grim options. The French king had made no significant relief attempt. The English held firm. Continuing resistance threatened the total collapse of the city and massacre of its inhabitants. In a decision born of pragmatism and heartbreak, Calais' leaders resolved to surrender, but not without bargaining for the best terms possible. Edward III, known for his ruthless pragmatism, agreed to negotiations, but his conditions shocked both the city's defenders and the wider medieval world. He demanded that 6 of Calais' leading citizens, wealthy merchants and nobles, come forth, barefoot, and dressed only in shirts, carrying the keys to the city, ready to surrender themselves to his mercy. The gesture was intended both as humiliation and an assertion of absolute dominance. Among those who stepped forward were Eustache de Saint-Pierre, Jean de Pierre de Wissant, and other men who accepted their fate not merely as individuals, but as representatives of Calais itself. According to chroniclers, these burghers prepared to face execution, their courage and dignity becoming a symbol of sacrifice. In a remarkable turn, Edward's wife, Queen Philippa of Hainault, intervened on behalf of the condemned men. Moved by their bravery and perhaps aware of the political implications, she pleaded with Edward to spare their lives. Whether motivated by compassion, political calculation, or both, Edward relented, granting clemency. This mercy was recorded in vivid detail by chroniclers like Jean Froissart, who emphasized the Queen's role in tempering the king's harshness. The 6 burghers were spared, the city surrendered, and Calais passed into English hands. The fall of Calais marked the beginning of nearly 2 centuries of English control, making it a vital military and trading outpost. Edward III fortified the city further, establishing it as a bastion for English campaigns on the continent. For the citizens, life under occupation was complex. Some adapted, serving in English administration or commerce. Others chafed under foreign rule. Yet Calais' position as the gateway to France made it an enduring symbol of the conflict. An outpost of English ambition amid a hostile land. The siege of Calais, often overshadowed by dramatic battles and political intrigue, stands as a testament to the slow, grinding reality of medieval warfare, that it was not swords or arrows that won or lost this conflict, but patience, starvation, and psychological endurance. The 6 burghers' sacrifice became a legend of civic duty and courage, inspiring later generations. But, more quietly, the siege shaped how cities and populations endured sieges for centuries through rationing, social cohesion, and negotiation. Today, the story of Calais' siege may seem a distant echo, yet its lessons resonate. In an age of instant communication and rapid warfare, the siege reminds us of the human cost when civilians become pawns, quiet suffering behind walls, the slow depletion of resources, and the necessity of negotiation and mercy still inform modern conflicts and humanitarian crises. Calais' siege teaches us that war is not only fought on battlefields but also in the homes, markets, and hearts of ordinary people. As we close this chapter of history, we reflect on a city that stood firm against hunger and hardship, that saw its leaders face death with dignity, and that endured to become a symbol of resilience. What other silent sieges in history shaped the fate of nations without the roar of cannon or clash of swords? Story 5. The Paperless Revolution: How Medieval Europe Copied Without Paper. A world without paper, and the slow spread of knowledge. Imagine living in medieval Europe, around the 12th century, where the concept of paper, as we know it today, was nearly unknown. Unlike the ancient Chinese, who had invented and used paper centuries earlier, much of Europe remained dependent on materials that were far less convenient and much harder to produce for writing: parchment and vellum. These were made from animal skins, expensive, time-consuming to prepare, and fragile compared to paper. The implications of this absence were vast. It shaped the way knowledge was copied, preserved, and disseminated, influencing the pace of scientific, religious, and cultural development across Europe. Let's take a quiet journey through the scribal workshops, monasteries, and early universities of medieval Europe to see how scribes labored over costly materials, how information was guarded and shared, and why the eventual arrival of paper centuries later was both revolutionary and yet slow to be fully embraced. Before the wide use of paper, European scribes relied on parchment and vellum, both derived from animal skins, typically calves, sheep, or goats. Preparing these materials was an arduous, smelly process. First, the skin was soaked in a lime solution to loosen hair and fat. Then it was scraped clean by hand with a crescent-shaped knife called a lunellum. The skin was stretched on a wooden frame and scraped again to the right thickness. Finally, it was polished with pumice stones to create a smooth surface suitable for writing. This process could take weeks for a single batch of parchment. Each large manuscript required dozens, sometimes hundreds, of sheets. Given that each sheet came from an individual animal, producing a single Bible or scientific treatise meant the lives of dozens of animals. Because parchment was so expensive, scribes were forced to be cautious. Mistakes were costly, so corrections were often limited to scraping off ink carefully or adding marginal notes. The production and copying of texts in medieval Europe was primarily the domain of monasteries. Monks in scriptoria dedicated writing rooms worked painstakingly by candlelight to copy religious texts, legal codes, and some classical works. The pace was slow. A single scribe could spend months copying a complex manuscript. Illumination, ornate decorations, and illustrations added further time and expense but made texts more beautiful and valuable. Access to books was limited. Libraries existed mostly in monasteries, cathedrals, and royal courts. Books were precious. Objects often chained to desks to prevent theft. Because each copy was handwritten, errors crept in, but there was no simple way to correct or compare versions. This made knowledge fragile and susceptible to loss or distortion. By the 12th and 13th centuries, new centers of learning began to emerge in early universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These institutions increased demand for texts beyond religious scripture to include law, medicine, philosophy, and natural sciences. To meet demand, commercial scribes in urban centers started producing manuscripts for a paying clientele of scholars, clerics, and nobles. This shift moved book production partially out of monasteries and into a growing market economy. Still, the limitations of parchment and vellum remained a bottleneck for knowledge dissemination. Not all written communication depended on costly manuscripts. For daily use, people wrote on wax tablets, thin wooden boards coated with wax. Messages, accounts, or notes could be inscribed with a stylus and then erased and reused. Scrolls or rolls of parchment were sometimes used, especially for legal documents or records, but were bulky and less convenient than bound books. These materials served immediate needs but were not suitable for mass copying or long-term preservation. Though paper had been invented in China around the 2nd century BCE and was in widespread use in the Islamic world by the 8th century CE, it had not yet become common in Europe. Several factors delayed its arrival: geographic distance and the slow transmission of technologies. Established traditions and guilds centered around parchment production, limited trade routes connecting Europe with regions where paper was produced, suspicion of foreign goods and unfamiliar materials. When paper finally began to trickle into Europe via Moorish Spain and Italy, it was initially a curiosity used for cheap documents, letters, and some less prestigious texts. Though its adoption was gradual, paper would eventually revolutionize European literacy and administration. It was cheaper, easier to produce in quantity, and lighter to transport. This made it ideal for bureaucracies, allowing kings, nobles, and merchants to maintain records, contracts, and correspondence more efficiently. Moreover, the eventual proliferation of paper would help spur the development of the printing press in the 15th century, accelerating the spread of knowledge. The absence of paper shaped medieval Europe's pace of intellectual growth and political administration. It limited the number of copies, centralized knowledge in elite institutions, and made books precious objects. Yet it also fostered a culture of oral transmission, memorization, and close mentorship. In this context, scribes were not just copyists, but custodians of knowledge, responsible for its preservation and interpretation. As you rest in this quiet world of painstaking labor and delicate parchments, consider this: how might history have unfolded differently if paper had reached Europe centuries earlier? Would the Renaissance have dawned sooner? Would knowledge have spread wider and faster? Or did the slow, deliberate pace shape a unique culture of learning? Scribes, scripts, and survival, the art and challenges of copying knowledge. Having seen how medieval Europe managed without paper in Section 1, we now step inside the quiet, dimly lit rooms where scribes labored for hours, sometimes days, to reproduce manuscripts by hand. This was not merely copying words. It was a painstaking craft shaped by materials, social hierarchies, and the slow march of knowledge through generations. We will explore the scribes' daily routines, the scripts they used, the transmission of knowledge despite material scarcity, and how their work laid the foundation for Europe's intellectual future. Even before paper took hold, most large monasteries maintained a scriptorium, a designated room or hall devoted to copying manuscripts. The scriptorium was usually quiet, with long tables, benches, and lamps or small windows for daylight. Here, monks or hired scribes worked seated, often hunched over desks with writing slants. The process began with preparing parchment sheets, cutting them to size, ruling lines with a dry point or ink to guide writing, and sometimes marking margins for illustrations or decorations. Scribes wore simple robes and worked with quills made from goose feathers, sharpened meticulously with knives. Ink was prepared from oak galls, iron salts, and other ingredients, mixed to produce a rich black that could last centuries. The atmosphere was solemn. Scribes often worked in silence or in soft chanting, reflecting the religious devotion that infused much of their labor. Scribes used various scripts depending on the period, region, and purpose. Early medieval scripts, like Caroline minuscule developed under Charlemagne's reign, were clear and rounded, designed for readability. By the later Middle Ages, more compressed and elaborate Gothic scripts became popular, which could be dense and harder to read but allowed more text per page. A practical choice given costly materials. Learning to write in these scripts was a long process. Young novices spent years copying alphabets, letters, and standard texts to master calligraphy and spacing. The scribe's handwriting was not only functional but also a form of art, each letter shaped with care, sometimes with decorative flourishes. Mistakes were costly. Ink errors were scraped off with a knife and the surface smoothed again, but this could damage the parchment. For more severe errors, entire sheets might be discarded. Many manuscripts were illuminated, that is, decorated with colorful illustrations, ornate initials, and gold leaf illumination was often the work of specialized artists called illuminators, who might work separately from scribes. The process added both time and expense, but made manuscripts prized possessions, symbols of wealth and piety. Texts, especially Bibles and prayer books, were most commonly illuminated, but legal documents and scientific treatises sometimes received embellishments as well. These visual elements helped readers navigate the text and made the books treasured. Heirlooms scribes did more than copy. They occasionally added notes, corrected errors, or inserted commentary. Because each copy was hand-produced, variations between manuscripts arose. Sometimes errors crept in, but often scribes deliberately adapted or updated texts to fit new contexts. This fluidity means medieval manuscripts often exist in multiple versions, an early form of textual evolution. Despite limitations, the scribal culture was instrumental in preserving many classical works that might have otherwise been lost after the fall of Rome. It was through these copies that Aristotle, Galen, and other ancient authors survived to influence Renaissance and later thought. Producing a single manuscript was expensive and time limiting access to knowledge. Books were scarce. A monastery might own a few dozen, a university slightly more, but widespread literacy was nearly non-existent, because parchment was heavy and costly. Books were small and compact when possible, with tight scripts and little white space. Bookbinding was also an art, using wooden boards covered in leather, sometimes reinforced with metal CLAs. PS. The physical weight of books limited their transport. Often, scholars had to travel to access texts or rely on borrowed copies. Though paper existed in Islamic Spain by the 11th century, it took several more centuries to become common across Europe. Early paper was introduced via trade routes and manufactured in small quantities. Initially, it was used mainly for everyday documents, letters, and inexpensive books, never for precious illuminated manuscripts. However, paper's advantages became obvious. It was cheaper, lighter, and easier to produce in larger quantities. The gradual adoption of paper helped shift knowledge production out of monasteries and into growing cities, where merchants, clerics, and scholars operated. Despite the eventual rise of paper, the medieval period's reliance on parchment shaped Europe's intellectual history deeply. It created a culture that valued the physical book as a sacred object, not just a text. The slow pace of copying encouraged careful selection of what was preserved and passed on. It fostered a system where oral tradition, memorization, and mentorship complemented written texts. In this way, Europe's paperless centuries laid the groundwork for the explosion of knowledge that would follow the printing press. As you consider the patience and precision of medieval scribes working without paper, ask yourself, how might the preservation and transmission of knowledge differ today if those early custodians had been replaced by machines? And what is lost when human hands and eyes shape the flow of ideas? From parchment to paper, the quiet dawn of a new age. As the 14th century unfolded, the European world was on the cusp of profound change. The painstaking, costly tradition of copying manuscripts on parchment and vellum was about to be challenged by a new material, paper, imported slowly through trade routes and produced in fledgling mills. The paper promised to alter the landscape of knowledge, administration, and culture forever. Yet, this transition was neither swift nor uniform. The story of Europe's shift from parchment to paper is one of gradual adaptation, skepticism, and eventual transformation. In this final section, we explore how paper arrived, how scribes and scholars responded, and the lasting consequences of this silent revolution. Paper had been invented in China during the Han Dynasty, nearly 2 millennia earlier, and from there it spread westward along the Silk Road. Islamic cultures had adopted and refined paper production by the 8th century, setting up mills in cities such as Baghdad and later in Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain. By the late Middle Ages, paper began trickling into Europe via Mediterranean trade routes, especially through Moorish Spain and Italy's bustling ports. The earliest European paper mills appeared in the 12th and 13th centuries, primarily in Italy. These mills initially produced paper for low-cost-to-use letters, receipts, and administrative records. Paper's affordability and ease of production were immediately attractive for expanding bureaucracies, merchants, and notaries. Despite the paper's practical benefits, many scribes and institutions resisted its adoption. Parchment had been revered for centuries. As a noble and durable material, it symbolized the sacred and the official. Many scribes distrusted the relatively fragile paper, fearing it would not preserve texts as long. Moreover, established guilds of parchment makers, scribes, and bookbinders had vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Monastic scriptoria, the traditional centers of manuscript production, were slow to embrace paper, partly due to conservative attitudes and partly because they controlled parchment supplies. For illuminated manuscripts, highly prized religious and artistic works, parchment remained the preferred medium well into the 15th century. Paper's key advantage was its availability and cost-effectiveness. Mills could produce large sheets quickly, and paper could be manufactured from linen, rags, hemp, and other fibrous materials, which were far more abundant than animal skins. Its lighter weight made transportation easier, facilitating the movement of documents, letters, and eventually books across Europe. Paper's surface, while less durable than vellum, was suitable for the increasingly popular Gothic scripts, which allowed dense text layouts that occupied space and material. With paper, scribes could produce multiple copies faster, meeting the growing demands of universities, courts, and growing commercial centers. For centuries, manuscripts combined both parchment and paper. Early printed books, known as incunabula, often used parchment for title pages or covers, paper for the main text. Scribes adapted to writing on paper, adjusting ink recipes and preparation techniques. Bookbinders learned new methods to handle the more flexible sheets. This hybrid period reflects a pragmatic approach to change, valuing tradition while embracing innovation. The invention of the movable type printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century accelerated paper's rise. Mass printing required abundant, affordable writing surfaces. Paper met this need perfectly. Books, pamphlets, and documents flooded into the market, democratizing knowledge previously confined to elites. This proliferation contributed to the Renaissance, Reformation, and scientific revolution periods marked by unprecedented intellectual and cultural growth. Europe's paperless centuries were characterized by patient craftsmanship, scarcity, and cautious progress. The transition to paper was neither instant nor inevitable, but a gradual adaptation that balanced respect for tradition with practical needs. This quiet revolution changed not only the medium of writing but the very nature of knowledge dissemination and cultural development. Today, as we live in an era dominated by digital text, it is worth remembering the centuries when knowledge was painstakingly inscribed on costly animal skins and how the introduction of paper quietly set the stage for the modern world. So, as you drift toward sleep with thoughts of ink and parchment, ask yourself, how might the fragile hands of medieval scribes have viewed today's digital age? And what might history have lost or gained if paper had never made its quiet journey into Europe? Story 6. The Great Molasses Flood, How a Sticky Disaster Shook Boston. A city swept away by sweetness. Imagine standing on a sunny January afternoon in 1919 Boston, Massachusetts. The streets are bustling with people bundled against the winter. Chill, horse-drawn carriages mingle with the early automobiles, and the city hums with a mix of industry and daily life. Near the bustling waterfront, towering above you, is a massive cylindrical tank, its smooth steel sides gleaming faintly in the cold light. Inside this tank, over 2 million gallons of thick, sweet molasses wait, destined for use in factories producing rum, candy, and even industrial alcohol. This tank is no ordinary container. It's the centerpiece of a booming business in Boston's North End, but within moments, it will become the source of one of the most bizarre and devastating industrial accidents in American history. The Great Molasses Flood, the rise of the Purity Distilling Company. To understand the disaster, we must first understand the Purity Distilling Company, the business behind the tank. During World War I, the company thrived by producing industrial alcohol used in munitions, solvents, and medical supplies. Molasses, a byproduct of sugar refining, was fermented to produce this alcohol. Boston's North End was home to many immigrant workers employed in the booming food and chemical industries. The Purity Distilling Company's large molasses tank stood as a symbol of industrial success, massive, modern, and seemingly stable. Yet beneath the surface, problems were mounting. The tank had been built quickly to meet demand, and questions about its construction and safety would soon prove fatal. The tank design, construction, and warning signs. The molasses tank stood approximately 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, holding over 2.3 million gallons of molasses, the equivalent of nearly 12,000 tons of sticky syrup. Constructed in 1915, the tank was hastily designed and built. Reports later revealed that it was only 1/2 inch thick steel, riveted rather than welded, an approach that was cheaper but less robust. Even before the disaster, workers noticed signs of trouble. The tank leaked. Molasses sometimes oozed from seams, staining nearby buildings and streets brown. Local residents joked about the molasses mountain, but no serious action was taken. Engineers in retrospect pointed to inadequate testing and lack of proper safety standards as critical failures. The day of the flood, January 15, 1919, on a cold winter afternoon, just before 12:30 p.m., the tank suddenly failed. Witnesses described a terrifying, thunderous roar as the tank's walls buckled. A wave of molasses, moving at an estimated 35 miles per hour, surged outward in a 25-foot high wall. It tore through the North End neighborhood, sweeping away everything in its path. Horses, carts, buildings, and people. The sticky flood engulfed streets, basements, and even the nearby railroad tracks. The cold air quickly began to chill the molasses, causing it to thicken and trap victims and debris alike. Emergency services and volunteers rushed to the scene. Rescue efforts were hampered by the sticky, viscous nature of the molasses, which made movement slow and difficult. Trapped people struggled against the heavy syrup, and many victims drowned or suffocated. Workers, firefighters, and neighbors labored for days to clear the streets, using salt water, sand, and even salt to dissolve the molasses. The cleanup continued well into the spring, with molasses still present in hidden corners and drains. The Great Molasses Flood resulted in 21 deaths and around 150 injuries. Victims ranged from small children to elderly residents and workers. Many of the injured suffered from broken bones, crushing injuries, and hypothermia caused by exposure to the cold molasses and winter air. The tragedy shocked the nation, but also raised questions about industrial responsibility, public safety, and the oversight of rapidly growing industries. In the days following the flood, investigators sought to understand why the massive tank had failed so catastrophically. Was it poor design, shoddy construction, inadequate inspection, or a combination of these factors? The disaster would become a landmark case in industrial safety law, but many wondered how such a dangerous structure had been allowed to exist in a populated neighborhood in the first place. As you settle into the quiet calm of history's less flashy moments, consider, how often do disasters lurk behind everyday structures, waiting for the slightest weakness to unleash chaos? The collapse and chaos unraveling the flood's deadly surge dot following the sudden and violent rupture of the massive molasses tank on January 15, 1919. The North End of Boston was transformed from a bustling working-class neighborhood into a chaotic scene of destruction. despair, and sticky turmoil. To understand the true nature of this disaster, we must explore the mechanics of the tank's failure, the terrifying power of the molasses surge, and the immediate aftermath as rescue and recovery efforts struggled against the strange and viscous flood. The tank had been under pressure due to several contributing factors. First, the weather played a surprising role. In the days before the flood, an unseasonably warm spell raised the temperature from the typical cold January chill to near 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius. The molasses inside the tank, which had been thick and cold, began to warm and expand. This expansion increased internal pressure on the already weak steel shell, which had flaws from its hasty construction. Rivets loosened, and metal weakened under stress. Eyewitnesses reported hearing groaning and popping sounds in the minutes before the explosion. Some nearby workers saw small leaks that worsened suddenly. At roughly 12:30 p.m., the bottom and sides of the tank gave way simultaneously. The steel buckled outward like a shattered drum, unleashing the full weight of over 2 million gallons of molasses. The surge, a 25-foot wave of sticky, escaping molasses, was terrifying. Moving at speeds estimated at up to 35 miles per hour, the thick, dark syrup formed a towering wave that crashed outward, crushing buildings, vehicles, and people in its path. Unlike water, molasses viscosity meant it clung to surfaces and trapped objects and victims with sticky tenacity. The wave was roughly 25 feet high at its crest and 160 feet wide as it surged through the streets. It swept away horse-drawn wagons and early motor vehicles, smashed wooden buildings, and flattened trees and fences. Nearby railroad tracks were warped and twisted by the weight and force. The sheer unexpectedness of the disaster left no time for warning or escape. Tragically, the flood claimed 21 lives. Victims included workers, children playing outside, and passers-by. Many drowned in the thick molasses. Others suffered crushing injuries from falling debris. The cold winter air quickly cooled the molasses, thickening it and making movement even more difficult for survivors and rescuers. Accounts describe victims calling for help, trapped waist-deep, or completely submerged in the syrup. Rescuers faced a nightmare scenario, struggling to free people stuck in the glue-like substance. The response to the disaster was immediate but complicated. Firefighters, police, and local volunteers rushed to help, but the unusual nature of the flood demanded unconventional solutions. Molasses is hydrophilic. It absorbs water, becoming even stickier as it cools. Rescuers poured large amounts of salt water, sand, and even salt to break down the molasses and aid in freeing trapped victims and clearing debris. Heavy equipment was brought in to remove wreckage, but the thick syrup clogged drains and coated streets for months. Cleanup crews worked through freezing temperatures and muddy conditions, sometimes slipping and falling into pools of molasses themselves. In the weeks and months following the flood, the Purity Distilling Company faced intense scrutiny. Investigations revealed serious faults in the tank's design and construction: thin steel walls, inadequate rivets, and no proper safety testing. Witnesses described ignored warnings about leaks and structural concerns. The disaster prompted one of the largest lawsuits of the era, with claims filed by victims and property owners. The court case lasted over a decade, ultimately holding the company liable for negligence. This legal precedent influenced future industrial safety regulations and corporate accountability. The Great Molasses Flood was emblematic of an era of rapid industrialization in the United States. Factories and storage facilities expanded quickly, often outpacing safety standards. Urban populations lived and worked close to large industrial operations, increasing risks. Though molasses flooding is unique in its details, the broader theme of unseen dangers hidden behind industrial progress resonates widely. As you contemplate this sticky disaster, consider how industrial growth can sometimes come at a hidden cost. The flood reminds us that behind everyday infrastructure, tanks, factories, and pipelines lie complex systems that require careful oversight. Small oversight, when combined with nature's unpredictability, can lead to unexpected catastrophe. How often do we live with risks unseen, trusting structures to hold? In the cold winter of 1919, the Great Molasses Flood left a sticky scar on Boston's North End, a disaster so unusual that it etched itself into the collective memory of the city and the nation. But beyond the immediate destruction and tragic loss of life, the event set in motion changes that reverberated through industrial safety, urban planning, and legal accountability. This final section explores the long, complex aftermath, the painstaking, Cleanup, the emotional toll on the community, the landmark court case, and the lessons learned that shaped modern industrial oversight. The flood left behind more than wreckage. It left a residue that clung to every surface. Residents described the streets and buildings coated in layers of molasses. The syrup seeped into basements, gutters, and soil. Even weeks later, children could find patches of hardened molasses in forgotten corners. Cleanup crews worked tirelessly in the harsh winter, using salt water and sand to break down the sticky syrup. Firefighters sprayed water jets to wash away residues, but the cold weather quickly congealed molasses again. Workers faced dangerous conditions, slipping in the viscous substance, and contending with the foul smell of fermenting molasses mixed with the bitter cold. Property owners repaired damaged buildings and replaced destroyed vehicles. But the economic impact lingered. 21 lives were lost, including workers, children, and passers-by, leaving families shattered. Victims, relatives, faced emotional trauma and financial hardship. Many injured suffered lasting disabilities. Local hospitals were overwhelmed with molasses-related injuries and hypothermia cases. The disaster drew nationwide attention, prompting donations and volunteer efforts to aid the community. Despite the tragedy, the North End's residents showed remarkable resilience, rebuilding homes, businesses, and lives with a spirit shaped by hard work and solidarity. Perhaps the most significant legacy of the flood was the landmark lawsuit filed against the Purity Distilling Company. The court case, lasting nearly a decade, examined the company's negligence in tank design, construction, and maintenance. Expert witnesses detailed how the thin steel, poor rivet work, and lack of proper safety inspections doomed the tank. Testimonies revealed that company officials ignored warnings about leaks and structural weaknesses. In 1925, the court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, awarding damages to victims and holding the company accountable. This case helped establish stronger legal standards for industrial safety and corporate liability. The molasses flood highlighted glaring gaps in industrial regulation and inspection. In the years following, government agencies began to implement stricter safety codes for storage tanks and factories. Engineering standards improved, emphasizing material quality, structural testing, and regular inspections. Urban planning incorporated greater separation between industrial facilities and residential neighborhoods. These changes aimed to prevent another disaster of similar scale. The Great Molasses Flood has endured as a curious chapter in Boston's history. It inspired books, documentaries, and even children's stories that recount the odd disaster with a blend of humor and solemnity. Local historians and residents commemorate the event as a reminder of both industrial ambition and its risks. Molasses remains a metaphor for slow, overwhelming forces, sticky situations beyond control. As we reflect on the Great Molasses Flood, we are reminded that danger often hides in plain sight. A seemingly innocuous storage tank, a lapse in oversight, and natural forces combine to unleash destruction. In modern times, we rely on complex systems, power grids, bridges, pipelines, each carrying its own risks. The flood asks us to consider how vigilance, regulation, and accountability protect our communities from unseen threats. So, as you rest in the calm after this sticky storm, ask yourself, what everyday structures or systems might harbor hidden dangers today? And how can we balance progress with prudence to prevent future disasters?